The era that, or I guess the one movement of this era that is perhaps most studied is, of course, the Civil Rights Movement, which really got its start in the 1950s. Of course, much of the Civil Rights Movement was rooted in earlier laws and the principle of segregation, which was set up by the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, which essentially established that it was constitutional to allow segregation, that blacks were considered separate but equal under the law. And of course, this allowed for a lot of southern states to really discriminate against blacks. Blacks could be denied education. They had to go to their own schools. They couldn't attend certain hospitals. They couldn't sit in certain restaurants. Or rather, they could, but they would have to sit in their own sections. They couldn't intermingle with whites, and it really created a two-tiered system in the United States. Of course, World War II, as blacks fought in World War II and they were fighting for freedom, this aroused a greater concern for inequality at home. Eisenhower, however, was perhaps a bit fearful of really pressing this legislation to change civil rights. However, it should be noted that he did, in fact, support some initiatives, especially following the Brown versus the Education of Topeka ruling, which overturned segregation in public schools. This is a good example of segregation, a white water fountain and a color water fountain. This led eventually to blacks themselves taking action. Very famously, Rosa Parks led a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. It was followed up by black students trying to enroll in white high schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. To keep the peace and to protect the black students, Eisenhower was actually forced to send in paratroopers to protect these students. Imagine going to school with your own personal military guard attending all classes with you. Of course, one of the key figures of the Civil Rights Movement was Dr. Martin Luther King, who really learned a lot of his tactics from Gandhi, who we looked at earlier, who really emphasized nonviolence as a way to win the moral crusade against the inequality of American society. Here is just a film clip. Of course, you can find this online. This is a film clip showing the Montgomery bus boycott and the role of Rosa Parks in it. Here we see the paratroopers escorting these black students in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And so after the 1950s, we really got to consider whether or not this was in fact the greatest generation. Lots of things to consider on either side of that particular argument. But at the end of the day, the 1950s were generally remembered as a stable and prosperous era, especially in light of the disruption in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, of course, 1960s began with a new president, a very young president, popular president, John F. Kennedy, who narrowly won a debate, or won the presidential election on the strength of a debate that for the first time ever was televised on national television. But events turned very turbulent at home and abroad, as we've already seen with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs fiasco and some of the controversy over the Cuban Revolution. Of course, this was also an era, too, of some very high-profile assassinations of John F. Kennedy, his brother Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. Again, here you can see one of John F. Kennedy's very famous speeches, his inauguration speech, where he asks, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Now, of course, it was in the 1960s the Civil Rights Movement really got moving. Of course, it was during the JFK and Lyndon Baines Johnson presidencies that it can no longer be ignored. And this is largely because of some of the actions that blacks and whites, especially college students from the North, who saw on television for the first time some of the inequity that was going on in the South. It really shows us, again, much like Vietnam War, the power of television in this era to really motivate people to take action against the injustices that they see in their society. Suffice it to say, the civil rights became a very embarrassing issue for the United States as they tried to fight against communism abroad.